Taxes. They fund roads, healthcare, education, and wars. Paying them has long been a fundamental part of the social contract. But are taxes effective in redistributing income and building a fairer society? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
I'm not that heartless. So I wouldn't mind if the government asked me to contribute a few extra bucks to help the poor.
We are forced to pay them. It's not a voluntary action.
When we have inequality getting out of control, this certainly brings problems for society in which, the poor hate the rich hate the poor.
How is he making $1 billion a day? How did he get there?
Today's debate, is it time to rethink taxes? I'd like to welcome our guests. Martin Krause is a former professor of economics at the Faculty of Law in the University of Buenos Aires. Sanjit Dhami is a professor of economics at the University of Leicester. Pedro Solimano is a journalist at DL News covering the cryptocurrency space. And Gustavo Flores-Macias is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Thank you all for being here. It's really nice to have you, and I'm excited about this debate. So we are sitting in Argentina right now, in beautiful Buenos Aires, but people get pretty passionate about this topic wherever they are around the world. So let's start big. Is it time to rethink taxes? I'll start with you, Martin. Kick us off.
It always will be, at least until we get rid of them.
Okay, until we get rid of them. So the ball has started rolling. Who wants to pick it up? Pedro, is it time to rethink taxation?
Yeah, I think fundamentally for sure. The idea of that taxes are just something that we have to pay blindly, no matter how institutions operate, no matter what sort of public services we're getting in return, seems a little outdated. I understand the argument for it, and I'm not completely against abolishing it, but I do think that we need to rethink them and rethink the technologies around them, rethink why we're paying them, what for, who's receiving them, in what amount. It's a long overdue conversation.
I'm glad we're having it. Gustavo.
I do think that taxation is important for at least three reasons. The first one has to do with paying for government services, paying for things like infrastructure, for public safety, which most people can agree are essential functions of the state, and maybe other aspects like education or healthcare that not everyone agrees should be something that the state is involved in. But the second reason has to do with it's a tool for redistribution, and I know this is also controversial. And the third one is about the link between taxpayers and government that taxation generates, that gives people a stake in the system, and it also prompts a sense of government accountability or the need for government accountabilities.
Martin, you gave a short answer that kicked this off. Would you like to elaborate now that you've heard two different positions?
Yes, I would like to go, let's say, to the end of the argument, and that is, I would raise two issues here. One is, why is it good to use coercion against people? If we do that as individuals, we'll be criminals and going to jail. Now, the government does that, and it is legal. Why it is different from what we can do? That on the one side. On the other side is that taxes, let's say, they get more difficult to develop the process of capital accumulation, which is the one that has lifted so many people out of poverty in the last 200 or 250 years. So my question will be, why are we willing to reduce that process of wealth creation and improvement for all, particularly those who are in the bottom?
Sanjit, we heard Martin use the word coercion there. And so from a behavioral economic point of view, do you see that as coercion? Why do people actually pay their taxes?
Yes, so fundamentally, taxes capture a human desire to redistribute money from the better offs to the ones who are not as good off. Um, Before governments came along, societies had various ways of redistributing income. The church performed that role for a very long time. Going back to hunter gatherer societies, where there were no taxes at all, there was a great amount of redistribution happening. In these societies, they critically relied for their survival on hunting meat at regular intervals. Now, it could be that a few hunters were successful in finding prey, but others were not. The ones whose families had not, the hunters who did not find the prey, their families would starve. So they developed powerful norms of sharing. So sharing resources from the better offs to the worse offs is a very fundamental human desire. Taxation is a mere modern manifestation of it. How high the taxes should be, what kind of taxes we should have, that's a slightly moot point relative to this deep underlying human preference. And insofar as taxes can perform a role in satisfying this underlying human preference, we might still see them for a long time yet.
I think a problem there is the scale when it comes to it, because hunter-gatherer societies were much smaller than, I don't know, Argentina has what, 54, 55 million. I'm from Chile, we have 20 million. And so obviously when you have a small community of hunter-gatherer, then it makes sense to sort of pool resources. Sharing becomes something a lot more like tangible. Whereas now, and I think I understand the argument for people who say, well, if I'm living in the north and there's somebody in Patagonia, why am I going to send the fruit of my labor halfway across the country when I can't even seem to find how my taxes are getting used here? So I think that's something that we need to also take into account, which is the scale of societies, how big they've become, when you're also putting in this conversation about taxation, because it's not as simple as just a church in a small community somewhere just redistributing to a few families, or a large village or something like that. When you're talking about millions of people, and you have people in Buenos Aires that have to send to Mendoza, that have to send to Patagonia, to Salta.
Perhaps one way to think about it, I think scale is important, certainly, but governments at the end of the day are meant to solve collective action problems. And these problems, the larger the size of the group, the harder it is to coordinate. So one would argue that with smaller groups, maybe you don't need a central authority to coordinate, but the bigger the group, then this coordinator body becomes more important. I think we've made considerable progress over time, but I think it's also important to consider the role of government in this prosperity. And markets require certain rules and certain order to function correctly. And I think, take financial markets. If there isn't oversight in terms of proper disclosure, then these markets can break down, or there can be, misrepresentation and so on. This, of course, happens, but with certain rules and enforcement, it becomes harder. So these essential roles that governments serve for markets to function and that play a role in prosperity, I think taxation becomes important in supporting these efforts.
Martin.
I think we have two different levels to discuss here. One is the efficiency level, or the economic argument about the need of a government and taxes, which is usually relies on the concept of public goods, the supply of public goods. But then there is a moral issue as well, which is what justifies the use of coercion against other people. Why do I use the word coercion? Well, that's the typical definition of political science regarding what a state is. It is the one with the monopoly on the use of force. Any one of us who use force will be going to jail, probably. Now, the government does it, and it is legal. So my concern and question is, when did that happen, that social contract? And was it agreed in a unanimous way? What about the people who disagree with that? So you force them into paying taxes that they don't want to pay.
Do you disagree that there is a social contract?
I don't think that you can prove that there was any social contract. And there is another question. If there was, at some point in history, a social contract, why should that social contract restrain us now when we were not part of that?
Okay, so this idea of coercion has come up again, and I love it. I want to explore that a little bit more because there's a clear point of view that this is coercion. Pedro, is that how you see it?
I agree. I wouldn't say necessarily the use of violence, but the threat of violence is definitely a key factor because there's a lot of people, and I do think that that's a fundamental wrong of the state or something that I don't think that it should have, at least blindly. And yeah, I do think that having that coercion or coercive action is definitely a problem, but I understand that its existence, because otherwise, what do you do? Because when you talk about moral obligation, there's also a moral obligation to pay taxes, whether you disagree or you agree with it. I know that if I pay $100 worth of tax, I know that maybe one will go to a public school or one will go to a hospital, just a small trickle. That's a moral obligation I have with the rest of society. We might disagree with the origins of the social contract and where it became and the illegitimacy of the state, but there is a moral obligation that I have, or that I believe that I have, with the people who are lesser off, that I should be helping out or participating in society. Whether that should be necessarily through the government, through state, through one big centralized authority, I think that you can definitely decentralize things. I think you can federate them. You can create some sort of autonomous organizations, whether that's regional, whether that's at the municipal level. There's a bunch of different ways that you can play around with it.
He brought up a moral obligation. Is that what you see based on the research? Is that why we do it?
I agree. And you see, try to imagine a world where there were no taxes. How would you fund the social services? Now, in the West, for instance, the social welfare state really took off after the Second World War. In the UK particularly, so the NHS came along, free healthcare at the point of delivery. It was free education to children. It was associated with massive increases in living standards across the Western world, which were unprecedented. And they went hand in hand with developments in how governments would raise enough tax revenues in order to fund these growing services. Now, obviously, there are partisan differences in terms of how big the state should be. In the US, there are well-known differences between Democrats and Republicans about the size of the government. But I don't think anybody is really arguing that we should get rid of taxes altogether. I mean, that's an argument that one doesn't often come across, because one takes as given that government programs of various sorts are necessary for a just and fair society that we all desire to live in. After all, none of us would want to live in a primitive society where these programs were suddenly absent, where people wouldn't get access to healthcare, education, basic facilities. How are these going to be financed if not for taxation? So I suppose the debate really is, what kind of taxation? At what level should people be taxed? State or the federal level, for instance? What should be the mix of taxes? Income taxes or consumption taxes? Should we be taxing wealth? How much of the tax evasion that we actually do observe in the real world is something that we can control with actual policy? So I think those are some of the relevant debates to think about.
Martin, I have to go to you with that. Do you agree or disagree? Should we reframe this debate?
Well, as I said, and I would like to go somewhat deeper on that, there are two issues here. One is the moral one, the other is the economic one. Let me end with the moral one. I think that and I agree that we have a kind of a moral duty to concern for those who are in a bad situation and condition. Now, and let me bring this into a kind of a story. Let's suppose that I die and I go to heaven, and at the door of heaven is St. Peter is there. He certainly is going to ask me this. Okay, he's going to say, in order to get into here, you please answer to me, what did you do for the others, for the poor, for those who are in need? And then I start getting nervous, and I think, what can I say here? And then it comes to my mind, well, wait a second, I pay taxes, and with the taxes there were a lot of social programs that help the poor build houses, etc. St. Peter is going to say that those resources were taken from you coercively. You did not pay voluntarily, and whenever you could, let's say, evade in some way, you did. So I'm sorry to say, but that argument will not open the door of heaven to you. Okay, so please wait there a second. Then comes on the same position, comes the government official in charge of the social plans and social policies. He is asked the same question, and he also says, oh, well, I did a lot of things for the poor. I run all these social programs that help the poor. And St. Peter is going to say, oh, wait a second. That was made with someone else's money who was taken coercively from their pockets. And I'm asking you what you did for the poor with your own money, with your time, and with your own effort. So you are not getting into as well. Go there is someone else waiting. So what I mean with this is none of us get a moral justification about what is done with taxes, because we are forced to pay them. It's not a voluntary action, which I certainly regard as superior in a moral way, that we voluntarily take our money and help the poor, and we go and help the poor, not the government, us.
Can I just come in on the fact on the coercion issue?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we do have an element of choice, and that element of choice comes via voting for different political parties who have different platforms on how high the taxes ought to be. The other thing is that despite a lot of social programs being undertaken through taxes, there's a great proportion of social programs that are also taken up through charitable contributions. Now, these same individuals who are paying supposedly high taxes then are paying extra money in charitable contributions to fund more private social services. So I think we observe a mix of it, and we're not as helpless as some of the comments would suggest. We still have an element of choice, a bit of maneuver room, if you will.
I also think that there's a couple things that, for example, in the U.S., and you know this, you tell the taxman how much money you made last year. You do your own taxes. So you also have a choice there to tell them how much you made, and you can sort of, to a degree, decide on how much you want to get taxed. And so there is also an element of choice there. I've worked for many years as a freelancer, and in Chile, I also had the choice. Okay, I can decide to avoid taxes, evade taxes, and there's also a choice that I make there. And then there's a second order, which is, if we leave this all to voluntarism, and we get to decide how much we provide or how much we give, that's going to separate the gap or segregate the gap even further, if you ask me. Like, I come from Chile, one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have a Gini coefficient of, last time I checked, like 0.44 or 0.43, something like that. And if there was no, and you can see the absence of the state there, and you can see that gap just growing and growing and growing. And so you have to think to yourself, all right, if you eliminate the state completely, what's going to happen to that whole bunch of people?
I want to pick up in the inequality. And Gustavo, I want to bring that to you, because earlier we heard this beautiful moral quandary question that I also kind of want an answer from you on how you see what Martin brought up. But we're living in a time when the richest 1% hold nearly half of the world's personal wealth. And I can't even say that sentence without a little bit of disdain, but I wonder, is that a problem?
Yeah, I think the moral question is very important. But let me take a step back and say that public policy is always necessarily an exercise in choosing the least bad option, right? So rarely do we get to pick ideal scenarios and see them through. And we can maybe think of an ideal world in which we would have government services that are effective and equal opportunities for people to succeed in life, and we have then no taxation also perhaps, and people can decide whether they help others or not, and ideally they would. But the reality, I think, is complex. And if we take out taxation, which would bring the coercive aspect necessarily, then I think that world wouldn't exist. I think the system would break down. And I want to point to then more the externalities, or sort of maybe the more concrete material implications that this would bring. And I think we would have to picture a world in which maybe these government services are absent because no one is there to provide them, and individually it wouldn't make sense to bear the cost of building these roads or big airports or whatnot. But also a world in which redistribution might just not happen at all. And one can say, well, one should be free to decide whether one redistributes your own wealth or not, if you have it. But there are externalities, and I think this was implied in the conversation that, and in the question, Malika, when we have inequality getting out of control, this certainly brings problems for society in which, the poor hate the rich hate the poor. And there are parts of the world in which we see this even with some role of government, right? There are societies in which different sectors of society don't recognize each other as legitimate parts of that one society, which is certainly problematic to achieve national goals. And it leads to a world of it could be insecurity, it could be affecting business, it could affect prosperity. So it is true that ideally taxation would imply coercion, but I think the alternative could be a world of chaos and extreme inequality that I think we also wouldn't want to see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Martin, you painted a picture of this world of the afterlife. We just heard Gustavo paint a picture of what some would call a dystopian reality if we didn't have taxation. So I'm wondering from you, what does a world without taxation that's coercive look like?
Let me tell you on this side that the what is now part of the social policies is something brand new in the history of humankind. Must have 150 or 200 years. So we have had many societies where that was not the case, and all contributions were mainly voluntary. I can tell you this: it is usually supposed that the welfare state filled a vacuum. That wasn't it was not the case. Let me tell you briefly, in the story of Argentina, we started having an inflow of immigrants from Europe at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. There was no welfare state, and this was where all people, poor people coming in, attracted by the opportunities that the country was giving at the time. And when they arrived, what they did, if there were no social programs and no help for the poor, they organized themselves in societies, charity societies, of societies for mutual help, where they cover all the needs of the members, and all that we all call welfare was part of that voluntary organization. So when the welfare state then took over those organizations, at the time in Buenos Aires, there were more than 1,200 friendly societies that were organized, most of them through the origins of there were Spanish, there were Italian, there were German societies, there were all kinds of that. If you go around this city, you will find the German hospital, the British hospital, the French hospital, the Spanish hospital. And where did all this come from? Well, there were the communities that actually built the hospitals at the time, because there was no public or state hospitals. I mean, Elon Musk made $1 billion yesterday. Fine. But I'm concerned, are the poor are getting opportunities to go up or not? I don't mind about the others. And if they make that lot of money, fine. It's going to come back to us either through consumption or investment in one way or the other.
So very briefly, because I like that's a little grenade on this table, that you're not concerned with the differences in income. But before we get there, how then do you solve for what you are concerned about, which is, are the people at the bottom rung doing well enough?
Well, first of all, there are three ways that you can help the poor, or let's put it the way markets help the poor. First of all is the best from an economic perspective and from a moral perspective, which is jobs. Having opportunities for jobs. That's the best way that people will make themselves out of poverty, not by helping them, giving them money, but actually allowing them to earn their own money, which is good not only for their living, but also for their self-esteem, let's say. So one is that. The other is the one that I mentioned recently. That is the mutual cooperation. People organizing themselves to supply themselves with all kinds of services and needs. And the third is philanthropy. All of us giving and helping the poor.
So the data does not show that inequality is correlated with growth rates. So it's not necessarily the case that if you're more or less unequal, you have high or low growth rates. So in terms of countries' growth rates, it doesn't seem to make a difference. But it seems to make a big difference to the social fabric of the country. So high inequality is associated with low levels of trust, with high levels of imprisonment, with greater incidence of teen pregnancies, and so on. So, I mean, and social strife. People develop envy. People who are not as well off might be envious of people who are the have-nots and the haves. So it can lead to all kinds of social tensions, and the higher stress levels and lower levels of mental health in more unequal societies as well. Wow. Now, if we claim that, well, inequality is something that I can live with, then I have to be willing to factor in the social costs of some of the things that I've just mentioned.
Pedro, can you live with those social costs?
I mean, so most of you made some pretty compelling points, and I think it's important to address one of the big ones, which is I think inequality and the differentials between the people that have and the have-nots is probably one of the most insidious problems that we have, because I also don't have a problem with Elon Musk making $1 billion. I guess I do have a problem with him.
I thought you did. Earlier
I
called it a grenade.
Yeah. I
meant it was being lobbed this way.
Yeah, no, I do think that's pretty insane that he can make $1 billion a day, because I think we also have to ask, how is he making $1 billion a day? Like, how did he get there? Like it doesn't make much sense for somebody, because he can obviously, I mean, he walks through the hallways of the White House. He goes and meets with parliamentarians around the world. Like, so, I mean, how did you make that $1 billion a day? But then there's another problem. What's the gap between him making $1 billion a day and the workers on the ground floor that are building his electric cars, that are building his robots, that are building his satellites? And like, if I look at it and I'm making minimum wage and I see the person above me making $1 billion a day, and I think to myself, well, that's just wrong. Obviously, if like the bottom half of if the bottom bit of my Maslow hierarchy of needs is covered, obviously I don't care that much about the differentials, because I don't have to worry about like having those sort of basic things to cover. But if I'm living in poverty or squalor, or seeing my boss make magnitudes more when a lot of that is coming from what I'm adding in, then I'm going to say, okay, there's something wrong here. There's something that needs to change. And then you can also, and then to kind of throw a curveball, you can kind of question the role of the state there, because the state enables that, And so you think to yourself, all right, where are lawmakers? Where is regulation closing that gap?
So say you're at the bottom, you are sweeping the floors of that factory. Then does it placate you if you know that the corporation or the person who leads that corporation is paying some taxes, and those taxes are going to help you the roads and the bridges? And then does it make you even angrier when you know they're not paying the amount of taxes you believe they should be paying?
I think it would definitely make me angry. I think, or maybe furious is more the word. Like, there's when you drive around Chile or Argentina, the roads are pretty much a mess, especially like we're here in Capital Federal. So things actually, like, depending on where you go, there's some sort of basis for things to work and things are okay. But as soon as you get outside, like, roads get pretty dismal. And so you think to yourself, all right, if the basis for the state is to build roads, as it always has been a trope for many, many years, why is there holes everywhere, And so, but back to your question, I do think that obviously it would infuriate me to know that the person that makes $1 billion a day is making a big loop around.
So the rich have honed finally the game of tax avoidance. So if you look at the top 0.01% of the rich in the West, they are able to hide about 25 to 30% of their income at a minimum.
Wow.
So tax avoidance is a very serious problem.
Is it a serious problem first, Martina? I'll get that from you. Do you see it as a serious problem?
You mean the income inequality?
The tax avoidance or evasion, or the ability to find a loophole that means you aren't giving to the social good.
Well, but it seems to me that in this conversation we are assuming that politicians are angels and they are striving to achieve the common good, the public good. So first, I would like to know what is that common good, and second, those are real people, and you know how they act. They are not angels. So starting from the assumption that they will be trying to achieve a common good is kind of a fantastic, I would say. That's not how it happens. They follow the same principle as we all do. They pursue their own interest, and that doesn't necessarily is a coincidence with ours. So let's talk about the real world and what politicians do with our money. Is that a better use that they do with our money than the one that I would use that money for? I don't think so. I think I would trust the people to help each other much better than expecting someone else in a position like that and with power like that to help the poor.
I've always thought an interesting idea, because I actually, to your point, Martin, politicians who are the ones that decide where you allocate resources around society. Why don't we send politicians that they have their compulsory for them to only go to public hospitals, for them to send their children only to public schools, for them to only use public transport, so they can see it, and they can see it firsthand. They can witness and feel the problems that the public system has. And then I'm sure we're going to start to see some considerable changes have. But if they all live in their nice private estates or wherever they live, making vast amounts of money, sending their kids to private schools and all that sort of stuff, of course nothing's going to get fixed, especially if we're just paying them their salaries and that nice, lavish lifestyle.
So, Gustavo, I'll give this to you. Do you think that we are giving too much credit to these politicians? Are we thinking of them as angelic beings who are doing the good of the world?
I think most people would have a hard time thinking of politicians as angelic beings, and for good reason. But the issue of evasion is very important, and it's something that is often thought of as tax morale, or sort of what shapes people's willingness to pay taxes. And there are two very important factors for this. One is a sense of fairness, that people around me are also paying their fair share. And the other is the results, the outcome of those taxes, what I get back in return in government services. And if either of those two is failing or missing, then people will have a harder time thinking that they should be contributing into the system.
Everyone here at this table has spent significant parts of your careers invested in this topic that we're discussing, and it shows. I'm wondering what alternatives then you've come up with or you've seen to the current order that we should be looking at. Pedro, maybe I'll start with you, because I know that you work in emerging technologies, digital currencies. Do you see a route there that we should be looking at when we're talking about alternatives?
I mean, I think that the topic of money itself doesn't get talked about enough in these sort of conversations. Just because, like, as a footnote, or not, it's not really a footnote, but there's an embedded tax in the money system, which is through inflation. And that hits the poor immeasurably more than it hits the wealthy. So there's that big issue. And I think that the emergence of something like Bitcoin or like stable coins, but mostly Bitcoin, is a fundamental change or an alteration in how the system can fund itself, how the system can operate, how the system sort of keeps itself afloat. I think that Bitcoin is one of the most, if not the most important technologies that exists. There's arguments that say that no, because the internet is more important, because Bitcoin is like a subgenre of the internet. But I guess since it's applied to money, I do think it deserves something else. But I do think that you're seeing an emergence of an industry and of communities around the world that surround themselves on principles like openness, like transparency, like fairness, like permissionless, that are around things like Bitcoin and like cryptocurrencies, that and rightfully so. Like the state, you can think that it's essential, but it's proven to the world that it's not really doing its job properly. It's not. It's very opaque. It's supportive mostly of corporations or multinationals or high net worth individuals. And so the emergence of things like Bitcoin are an obvious alternative and a solution. It serves as a check against excessive spending. It serves as a check against inflation. It defunds the state to a degree, and it forces the state to provide much better infrastructure if you want me to actually continue to use your money. We live in a hyper-connected world. We need to be able to operate where I can send money around the world instantly for no fees, and you get the full amount that gets there instantly.
Martin, do you see it as a viable solution when we're talking about alternatives?
Definitely. I'm quite optimistic on that. Of course, I cannot foresee what is going to happen, but that is definitely a challenge to let's say, the monopoly of government. And I hope it will keep on growing and develop in ways that we cannot even imagine now. Now, I would briefly changing the subject, I will also point out that we have been talking about the taxes here, but from a, let's say, logical point of view, we should not forget that we should talk first about expenditures, government expenditure. That's the first discussion. What government does, what government should do. And once we have a definition on that, and then we should talk about taxes. How do we fund this? So it seems to me that this issue is closely linked to what the government does or should do. And then there go to taxes.
So what should taxes fund?
I think different societies have different needs, and it's maybe not that different if we think about it in terms of a family or a household, right? Well, different households have different needs depending on size, depending on, backgrounds and so on. But it is true that even, countries that tax at high levels with respect to their GDP don't necessarily show great results when it comes to spending, and others that maybe don't tax as much but do a lot more with that money. So there isn't necessarily the fact that a country might tax quite a bit, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll show results and that it'll put that government to good money to good use.
Why is that? Do we know?
Well, there are so many factors. So, corruption is a big one, at least in some parts of the world, where you really have a lot of that money. You have the leaky bucket, right? That from the taxpayer to the actual service or good that you're trying to finance, there are so many hands that took a piece of it that are not necessarily part of the vision as to how that money should be spent. So that's one. Sometimes it has to do with obstacles in political obstacles to how that money would be spent, and lack of agreement as to what these goals should be. Anyway, there are several factors, but let me give you just one example. Brazil for Latin America is the one country in the region that actually taxes at the levels that one would expect given the size of its economy. So the levels of taxation as a share of GDP are the highest in the region and are at the level, sort of the worldwide expectation. But when one looks at outcomes for education in Brazil, public education, they're very, very poor. And this is something that, that accountability with citizens is important, and just really to push governments to deliver on these expenditures. I think ex ante, it's difficult to say, well, because we're taxing this much, we need to spend this much. But there certainly has to be a connection, because if you're not spending the money that you're collecting, that's a problem.
Do you appreciate that difficulty? Do you agree with what you just heard?
Yes, I think that one way around, in a sense, of problems like that would be deeper decentralization of government, moving everything down from the national level to the state level, down from the state level to the local government. That will help, because people may be familiar with some problems in the neighborhood or in the district they live, but it's very difficult that they pay attention to the large problems at the national level, or the fiscal deficit or revenues. So it seems to me that it would be beneficial, let's say, if we bring down the different levels of government as well as taxation down to the local level.
Sanjit, I want to bring this back to how we got to this part of the conversation, which is thinking about alternatives.
So the Western tradition in economics stays very much within a system where governments have to perform a certain number of roles, which are considered extremely important, and we've spoken a lot about them. And to my mind, short of voluntary action, performing some amazing miracles, it's not clear to me how else, or your country might have natural resources that are so vast that you don't need taxation.
So we're thinking oil, we're thinking natural gas.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Short of that, it does not seem to me to be a practical option, but to go for some form of taxation. As I've said, what kind of taxes you should have, the mix of taxes, the levels of taxes, that's up for debate. And that obviously depends on what kind of country you live in, what kind of needs the country has.
I've learned so much at this table, and I want to leave us with just one question, because I think I can already imagine those who are watching and listening to this wondering. So rapid fire, just sort of about a sentence, if you could answer in that length of answer. Do you think you pay enough taxes personally? Gustavo.
I think I do. I live in the United States, so I guess it depends where you live. You can answer this question differently, but I think I do. And you've opened quite a box here with this last question, and I will get into that. But it really depends also where you are in the wealth distribution, how much in taxes you pay, at least nominally, and if indeed you fulfill your tax obligations, you can end up paying quite a bit of taxes, even the middle class. Anyway, so a lot of nuance in there. But I'll just say yes, I think I do.
Pedro.
Yeah, I think I do. It's also hard for me to say I do because I don't exactly know where my tax is going to. And so and this is a topic that I might have been insisting a lot, but if I could see it, I could say, no, I'm not paying enough. Or if I could see it, I could say I'm paying much more than I should. But I think I am.
Same question.
Well, just for perspective, I pay a marginal tax rate of 40%. So every £100 that I earn, I pay 40 in income taxes.
40.
40. The remaining 60 that I bring home with me, I pay 20% GST on that. So I pay £18 on that. So I'm getting at the end of the day £42 for every £100 that I earn. What I do observe is increasing hardship amongst the worst off in the UK. So the local council now no longer has enough money to cut grass on the verges outside. People whose children are disabled are finding it extremely difficult to get social support and care workers to come in because the government is running out of money. I could do the crib and say governments ought to be more efficient in the way they spend my money. Or I could just keep looking at these people and thinking, fine, it's their choice, they're poor. No, I'm not that heartless. So I wouldn't mind if the government asked me to contribute a few extra bucks to help the poor.
Wow. And GST is?
20%. Goods and services tax. It's the excise tax. It's when you buy something at a shop. So necessities like food items, most basic food items would be exempt from it because otherwise the poor would find it extremely difficult to buy. But most of the items that you would buy would be taxed around that rate.
Martin, we will end where we started. Do you think you pay enough taxes?
Definitely. I think, on the one hand, that those who favor taxes should be paying more voluntarily. Why don't they do that? And the second is, yes, I do pay more, particularly if I take into account what I get. I end up paying twice. I pay taxes for government education, but I need to pay a private education. Same with the health system, and I need to buy a health insurance. And same with security. That you need to live in a neighborhood giving you private security because the government does not. So I'm paying twice. And that seems to me it's paying too much compared with what I get.
Yes, thank you so much for this conversation, for the points, the anecdotes, the stories, and for sharing your own personal reflections at the end. I think they're very telling. I saved them for the end because I know they could be individual shows in their own selves. But thank you very much for your willingness to be part of this conversation. And thank you for watching.